India isn't too fond of China's actions around its borders.
June last year, China provoked India. It attacked Indian soldiers in Galwan. 20 Indian soldiers were killed in action. For the first time since the 1980s, blood was shed on the India-China border.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says his country is hurt and angry following Monday's border clash with Chinese troops in which at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Each side blames the other for the violence, the deadliest clash in the disputed Himalayan border region in 4 decades.
But the country at this point of time is caught in a crisis over a surveillance ship that's been sent by China. The ship in question here is Yuan Wang 5. It's a high-tech Chinese tracking vessel. But within days, India expressed a lot of concern about the presence of a Chinese ship being allowed to dock in Hambantota.
India isn't letting China just push its weight around. Much like China, India is strong and growing quickly on the world stage. Now both nations are face to face, fighting over humankind's most basic need: water. China is building infrastructure to dry up one of India's largest rivers in an attempt to slow down the nation, while India is taking steps to eliminate this risk. All this is creating tensions that could boil into dangerous conflicts between the two superpowers. These conflicts are becoming so severe that we might see the groundwork for a potential war being laid out. A war that, if not stopped, could drag the entire world with it, forcing the potential of a nuclear winter. So, how did we go from needing water to arming rockets? Well, in today's video, I'll explain that. I'll get into what exactly China is doing, its motives, and the vast implications this has for world peace.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
India's GDP grew by 13.5% in the first quarter of this financial year, their fastest since 2021. Better than the world, it's an impressive first quarter, much better than other major economies.
Expected to still see its economy grow by about 8.4%. That would really be one of the best growth rates in the world. So China is recovering much quicker than most of the rest of the world.
India has managed to not get adversely affected. This is no mean achievement given the population and the size of our country.
A few weeks ago, I made an extensive video talking about the water crisis that China is facing. For those who haven't seen it, feel free to check it out in the link in the description below. But let me summarize it all right now. China is facing one of the most severe global cases of a water crisis. As the droughts intensify, water is becoming more scarce. And it's not just the drought that has caused this. China's vast population and vast quantities of water needed for agricultural, domestic, and industrial use are taking a toll on the nation. When you factor in the fact that almost the entire population of China lives in the northern part of the country, which is very barren, while the available water resources are mostly in the southern regions, you begin to understand why this is a crisis. But the woes do not end there. Apart from the direct usage of water, China relies quite significantly on hydroelectric power to generate electricity. It goes without saying that China's energy needs are immense. You do not become the manufacturing hub of the world without a dependency on energy, now do ya? If you keep doing this elementary math and adding 1 + 1, you can see how a water crisis can also turn into an energy crisis, and together that can become a food crisis. Quite the chain, isn't it? Well, the overall point I'm making is that water is important to China. And by this same logic, you can see how the unavailability of water in any nation can trigger a food crisis and send a nation spiraling. This is why nations guard their water resources. Because, well, he who controls the water can control a nation. It is the knowledge of that realization that brings us into the India-China conflict. Now, before I jump into China's brutality, please take a minute to like this video. Covering war topics is always a little risky on YouTube, but your likes have been helping me a lot in terms of the YouTube algorithm. All right, back to it. In a bid to ease its own burden, China is addressing some of its water and energy needs. However, it's coming at a cost. What's the cost, you ask? Well, India, Bangladesh, and a few other Asian countries. Yes, nations are the price. Let me explain. This right here is the Brahmaputra River. It's an 1,800-mile-long river that begins in China's southwest Tibet region, where it is known as the Yarlung Tsangpo. From there, it continues and enters India in the mountainous, remote northeastern state of Arunachal Pradesh, where it is also called the Siang. It then descends into the plains of adjoining Assam state and ends in Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal. This one river, known by many names as it stretches across 3 nations, is a life source for hundreds of millions of farmers and residents. That is to say, nothing of the environmental benefit of something so large and grand. So where does the conflict fit into all of this? Well, China began to build a hydroelectric dam on the river in a bid to generate power. They did this in Gyaka, a county in Tibet. And yes, even though Tibet is supposedly an autonomous region, everyone and their grandmother knows that the firm hand of the CCP runs things there. Now, if China built one hydroelectric plant to provide energy for the 23,000 or so residents that reside there, it would be okay. In terms of energy output, that would be more than sufficient. However, to date, China has built not 1, not 2, but 4 hydroelectric plants in Gyaka. These are Dagu, which has an output of 640 megawatts, Xiacha, which outputs 320 megawatts, Jiasu, which outputs 560 megawatts, and Zhangmu, with 510 megawatts. Now, why would China want 4 superstations, all within kilometers of each other, all in the same low population density area? It's not like these stations are powering Beijing or anything. Well, when you factor in the fact that these hydroelectric stations are built upstream, and they take away from the water pressure and the water quantities that then channel down to India and Bangladesh, you quickly realize where the problem is. China has built unnecessary power stations to power a small city just to inflict pain on India. Or, well, that's what the optics look like, at the very least. That's not all, however. Right before the part of the river that turns to enter India, yes, this part, China made plans to build additional dams. 3 of them, actually. These are Pangsum, Liangsai, and Niang. So, let's run through this again. Right on the river stream that feeds into India, China has built 4 mega hydroelectric power stations and 3 dams. Yikes. You can understand why India is causing a ruckus. India is also not just fussing over hypotheticals either, no. There is a mountain of proof that the infrastructure that has been built is impacting the lower reaches of the waterway in India. This is evidenced by the simple and direct fact that the water levels in the Brahmaputra are plunging. In February of this year, 2 vessels from Bangladesh got stranded in the river as the water levels dropped. 2 dredgers were used to pull out the vessel. Now, I'm no judge, but it seems pretty clear-cut. There's a cause, there's an effect, and well, there's the regular old CCP. 4 stations and 3 dams, merely kilometers from each other, are a big factor to consider. But it's not the only fact to consider when you're looking at India being disgruntled. Remember when I said that most people live in northern China where it's dry, while most water sources are in southern China? Well, the CCP knows this, and back in 2003 they launched the $60 billion north-to-south water transfer project. This was a project aimed at drawing water from tributaries of the Yangtze River to replenish the dry north. This was part of a scheme to draw water from the south of China, where most of the freshwater supplies are, and to bring it to northern China, where most of the population lives. Bringing it to the present, the Brahmaputra River is a victim of this ambitious Chinese project. You see, Chinese engineers are testing techniques that could be used to build 1,000-kilometer tunnels, the world's longest, to carry water from Tibet to Xinjiang, a barren region in northwest China. Remember, the Brahmaputra River originates in Tibet, where it's called the Yarlung Tsangpo River. It's from here that China plans to divert water to its northern regions. India has taken a firm stance against this action. If water is diverted from the upstream Brahmaputra, then by the time it gets to the actual Brahmaputra in India, there will be nothing but a trickle. Again, there is evidence of this as the water levels are already dropping. Hundreds of millions of farmers and residents who depend on that river will be left in pretty dire situations. There will be hunger strikes in India, which, given its population, will cause a huge uproar. Bangladesh will also be a victim of this as well, given that the river passes through that nation too. Basically, China's actions are punishing India and Bangladesh in a very severe manner. This is something that India, they're not going to stand for. India has had disputes with China in the past, something you can go over in depth in this video I made before. You can find the link in the description. One thing that all previous China-India border disputes show is that India is not afraid to become militant if the need arises.
And in breaking news coming in from India, where an intrusion by Chinese troops led to clashes between troops of both the countries, Indian Army foiled the attempt which happened 3 days back. The PLA tried to intrude. Injuries have been reported on both the sides. The clash comes amidst the 9th round of military talks between India and China.
No shots were fired, but soldiers clashed and died. There are claims brutal, basic weapons were used. Two nuclear powers were in hand-to-hand combat, and both blame the other.
When this new threat of robbing India of water results in the suffering and death of millions in India, you can be certain that their response is not going to be gentle. It will be swift and strong. As journalists, one of the things we make sure to do is to maintain a level of impartiality, and this includes giving the benefit of the doubt to all parties. However, in a case like this, where China builds 4 power stations that are within kilometers of each other, 3 large dams, and begins to divert water from the very source of one of the primary rivers in India, well, it becomes hard to defend that action. China and India do not have any water-sharing treaties, just a hydrological data sharing pact from 2018. This means that, in theory, China feels it has the freedom to do as it pleases. But this is not something that India will let stand. Beijing has denied the allegations of causing harm to India, and through China's foreign ministry, spokesman Hong Lei has released a statement saying, "Our projects have not affected the lower stream regions, including those in India." Indian officials, on the other hand, are not buying this, with a local Indian state lawmaker, Tako Dabai, on record saying, "We suspect the sudden drying up of the Siang, the Brahmaputra, could be a result of China either diverting the river water on their side or due to some artificial blockades somewhere in the upper reaches." To protect its own interests, in addition to putting pressure on Beijing, India has begun considering a plan to build a 10 gigawatts hydropower project in a remote eastern state following the news report suggesting that China could construct even more dams on a section of the Brahmaputra River. The primary motivator for this is that Indian authorities are concerned that the Chinese projects could trigger flash floods or create water scarcity. And therefore, as a countermeasure, they have floated the idea to build the dam, which could help avoid any possibility of a drought in the region. Basically, it helps in aiding their cause and does not leave them entirely at the mercy of China's kindness. The reality of the matter is that China's continued actions will have devastating effects on India and Bangladesh. All those actions happening upstream of the river will no doubt cripple the things that are happening downstream. If China keeps ignoring India's pleas and warnings, what will happen is the same thing that has always happened between the two nations when it comes to border control: military conflict. Neither India nor China is a pushover, and any military conflict can easily have grave consequences. Whether the Brahmaputra will be the spark for war between the two nations is yet to be seen. But in the interest of peace, it is the hope of this journalist that matters don't devolve into that. As I mentioned earlier, war topics are not treated kindly by the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of my previous videos were demonetized, so let's hope this one doesn't meet the same fate. And that's why I launched a Patreon where you guys can support the videos. Please check it out by clicking the link in the description.